Hey, what's up everybody, it's Lids, and we're back for some more Gwent, and today we're taking a look at the 6 new Northern Realms cards from the new Gwent The Tide Rises expansion coming out July 11th. There will be 6 new cards for each faction, not including neutrals, and Northern Realms is the last faction. So these are the last of the new cards. Let's start with the common card, the Onager, which is a 4-power, 4-provision machine siege engine. Whenever you use an order ability, damage a random enemy unit by 1. And that's pretty simple. That means when you play this card, you're going to want to have it in a deck with a lot of other order abilities. Northern Realms is the faction with the most order abilities, so you should be able to get a lot of damage on Onager, as long as you can keep all those other order cards on the board. Because this is a passive effect, Onager doesn't have an order itself, that means that you can get a lot of value on the same turn that you play Onager, so although it is an engine, it is still possible to get some good tempo from it as well. It depends a lot on how risky you want to play it. Siege decks in particular tend to have a lot of units that have order abilities, although any card that can accumulate a bunch of charges could be useful as well. So things like Visigoda of Corvo, Visigurd, Cintrian Spellweaver, or Traveling Priestess. Any of those cards could single-handedly set up the Onager well. And I'm sure there will be a lot of comparisons between the Onager and the new Skellige card, the Funeral Boat. Both are 4-power, 4-provision units that deal 1 damage whenever you meet a certain criteria. Onager should come from almost entirely units, plus the occasional location order, although technically leader abilities are also orders, so that might count as well. Whereas the Funeral Boat is a little more unusual because you could get that setup from units, but it could also be special cards, anything that discards cards, and it also activates on your opponent's turn as well. Onager only activates on your own turn, so it's a little more predictable and has a little less flexibility with its setup, but might have more tempo potential than the Funeral Boat. The interesting thing about both of those cards is that although they are both engines, with 4 base power they are easily answered, so you might not be able to use them for long, but if you have a lot of setup on the board, they both still have a lot of tempo potential as well, turning into borderline point slams. So you could play the Onager and the Funeral Boat really early and get amazing value if it stays alive, but it would be much safer to play this mid-round when you already have a lot of setup on the board. That way, even if it does get immediately answered, you can still get good value. Next, for the rare card, we have the ship Ballista, which is a 4-power, 2-armor, 6-provision machine siege engine ship. It has an order to damage an enemy unit by 2, then boost a random non-boosted unit in your deck by the excess damage dealt. Increase the damage for each time you used an order ability on this turn. So on the surface, that might seem relatively simple. Deal 2 damage with an order ability, which doesn't sound that impressive, and if you happen to get excess damage, sure, you'll get a tiny little boost. But that's a deck boost rather than a board boost, which is a little unusual, but the really unusual part is how you increase the damage on the ship Ballista. Because if this is just a 2 damage order, at best, you're playing about 6 points for 6 provisions, which is bad value. But to increase that value, you need to have already used a bunch of order abilities on the same turn that you use the ship Ballista order. So basically, have a bunch of units with orders on the board, use all the other orders, and then as a turn finisher, use the ship Ballista order. That way, if you have, say, a bunch of siege engines on the board, and you use all those orders, you might be able to get this up to 5, 6, or possibly even higher damage, at which point ship Ballista becomes much more worthwhile. But it's still not that simple, because ship Ballista does not have Zeal. So that means not only is this relying heavily on having other cards on the board when you use it, unless you're using Inspired Zeal, you have to predict a turn ahead and hope that you aren't about to lose a bunch of your units with order abilities, otherwise you've already played ship Ballista, you know its order is going to be weak, and there isn't much you can do about it. Though like with the Onager, you might just need 1 unit with a whole bunch of charges on their order ability to set this up. So for all those reasons, ship Ballista is really clunky, unless you give it Zeal, and although you might get amazing value if you have a ton of order abilities, it's definitely a high-risk card to use. Next, we have the first Northern Realms epic card, Flotsam, which is a 9-provision artifact location with resilience. Deploy, create a bronze Northern Realm unit with an order ability. Order, refresh an allied bronze unit's order, then give it Zeal. So there are almost 40 bronze Northern Realms units with order abilities, and like with any other create ability, you're only going to be able to choose between 3 of them, unless you play Rune Mage, in which case you'll pick from 5 options. So that deploy ability is really unpredictable. There are tons of possible options, some that are much better than others, and some that will fit your deck much better than others. So that's really just a huge dice roll. Generally, that'll be a 3 or 4 point body with an order ability worth a few more points, depending on if it happens to synergize with the other things that you're trying to do. Then Flotsam's order is like Varaxxus's order ability, just that it only works on bronze units. And it pains me to say it, but there is at least one very obvious use case for this. Everybody's favorite card, Reaver Hunters. Or Reaver Scouts. I imagine that's how most people are going to use Flotsam, but theoretically it works for any other bronze unit with an order ability as well. Once upon a time, a card with a very similar effect to Flotsam's order ability, Casting Contest, was designed specifically to reset bronze mage order abilities, giving you a way to reset Banard Student, Aretuza Student, Meditating Mage, or Alumni order abilities. Those are probably your next best option, though as I said before, there are almost 40 Northern Realms bronze units with order abilities, so you do have a lot of options. So that is interesting how Flotsam's deployability is a total wild card, and then the order ability is very flexible and consistent, but unfortunately, I just can't see past how this is another card that supports Reavers. Then for the second Northern Realms epic card, we have Bernard Laredo, the local leader of Flotsam, a bunch of Witcher 2 themed cards here. He's a 5 power, 7 provision human soldier with an order to duel a random enemy unit. And that is crazy. Not crazy good, just crazy. Don't get me wrong, dueling is a really strong effect. We've seen a bunch of Clash cards in this expansion, and dueling is basically just a much more effective version of that. Rather than both your card and your opponent's card getting damaged simultaneously, instead, your card damages your opponent's card first, so it either outright destroys your opponent's card without taking any damage, or at the very least, it weakens your opponent's card before your opponent's card hits back, so that you can still target something bigger than your duelist. So the problem is not the duel. The problem is the random enemy part. Because usually before using a dueling order ability from Seltkirk or Ansace, you'd want to do the math to figure out how big of a unit you can destroy before you click that order ability. So basically, if the card you target has 5 power or less, then Laredo will immediately destroy it. If it has 6 or 7 power, then Laredo will be able to destroy it, but will take some damage in the process. Anything bigger than that, and Laredo can damage it, but he's getting destroyed. Whereas in this case, because it's a random unit, there might be a great target for Laredo to remove without even taking any damage himself, but he might randomly choose a 1 power token, or poke a huge unit that he could never destroy instead. So usually with your predictable duelists, you would do things like add boosts, armor, or a shield to increase the removal range, because then you get both the value from the boosts and also the extra value from the removal potential. The problem with doing that for Laredo though, is that you could give him all those boosts, an armor and a shield, but he might still randomly hit a tiny unit, making those investments less worthwhile. So with all that uncertainty, he is wildly inconsistent. So much so that he might just be a meme. The only potential workarounds that I can think of is that you play him turn 1, particularly on blue coin. That way, when you use his order, your opponent hopefully only has 1 unit on the board, and at least in that case, you know what he's going to do. In that case, you could even use Engineering Solution to give him a boost and a shield to increase his removal range in case your opponent plays a huge point slam at the beginning of the match. Or you could play him mid-round if you can remove all but 1 or 2 of your preferred dueling targets with damage to reduce the uncertainty on Laredo's order. So maybe if you have a ton of damage in your deck, you have enough use cases to make Laredo worth including, but otherwise, this is probably a card you can just ignore. Then for the first of the new Northern Realms legendary cards, we have King Demavin III, who is a 7 power, 13 provision human aristocrat. And the King of Edirn has a very unique ability. On deploy, he will banish 3 cards from your deck, but remember which cards you chose, because with his order, he will play a base copy of one of those cards, and then remove it from the theoretical list of cards that you banished with his deploy ability. Then that order has cooldown too. So what the heck does that mean? At first glance, you see that deploy ability and you might think that this is just a way to banish out some of the weakest cards from your deck for consistency. And if you think that Demavin will get locked or destroyed before you use his order ability, then maybe that is the case. But assuming that you can play him safely, maybe giving him Zeal with Inspired Zeal, or find a way to give him Veil, and you realize that you actually want to banish some relatively big cards, because Demavin will tutor one of those cards, if you can even call it that when technically you already removed the card from your deck, and do that every other turn. So the big risk here is that you assume that you will be able to safely use Demavin's order ability, and for that reason, choose 3 big cards with his banishing deploy ability, only for him to get locked or destroyed, which means that you will never see those 3 cards that you picked again. So you definitely need to be very careful about that. But if you can use that order, then you could guarantee that you can play 3 of your best cards, which is amazing, because that makes Demavin a 7-point body plus 3 of your best cards, if you can pull that off. However, you can only play one of those cards at a time, and you'll have to wait a couple of turns before you can get the next one. So it's not just a matter of does Demavin get immediately answered. You might be able to get that first card, but your opponent will have time to shut down Demavin before you get to the second or third card. That is, unless you use one of those cards to reduce Demavin's cooldown so that you can play those cards more quickly. The most reliable option for that would be Winch, which would give him a 5-point boost and immediately get his order off cooldown. So you could even do 2 Winches, giving Demavin a 10-point boost, and then still use that last order to get whatever other big card you really wanted. In that case, Demavin is a 17-point body with 3 thinning, including getting rid of 2 of your 4 provision cost cards that you otherwise might not have wanted to use, and 1 really big card. So that's definitely the most reliable way to use Demavin. It would require that you still have both Winches in your deck, not in your hand or your graveyard, as well as 1 or 2 other big cards to choose between for your final Demavin selection, so technically it's still not perfectly consistent, but it's pretty darn close. Alternatively, you could also use cards like Priscilla, Rivian Pikeman, or Siege Support, all of which can help get his order ability back off cooldown, but still won't be quite as smooth as using Winch. Alternatively, you could also use the Stockpile Leader ability to reduce his cooldown, and maybe that makes it feasible to choose 3 really big cards for Demavin. So definitely could be tricky to execute with the Demavin, though you could simplify with double Winch to play it safe, but the high-end potential is huge. Then for the last Northern Realms legendary card, we have RavenKimbolt, which is a 6-power, 13-provision human aristocrat soldier. On deploy, he will boost 3 bronze units in your deck by 1. Then the first time that an allied unit uses its order ability each turn, summon a random unit with the same power from your deck to this row. That is unbelievable, because that means that, assuming that you have a lot of order ability units, and that several of them have the same amount of power, then you could be summoning out an extra unit from your deck every single turn. And I know what you're gonna say,
Yeah, but sure, Lids, that's gonna take time. It'll be difficult to do.
yeah, not really. One of the main reasons is because that's a passive ability, which means you can activate that ability on the same turn that you play Kimbolt. So at a minimum, even if he gets answered on your opponent's next turn, he's still going to be a 13 provision summoning tutor with a 6-point body. A tutor that can summon any card from your deck. Doesn't matter if it's bronze or gold, doesn't matter if it's Northern Realms or neutral. And similarly with the order ability, doesn't matter if it's a bronze or a gold, doesn't matter if it's Northern Realms or neutral. So the ability is easy to activate and you can activate it immediately.
But it's limited to 1 use per turn, so your opponent could answer him immediately, and then you're only summoning out 1 card. That's not so bad, right?
Yeah, not exactly. Because if you immediately use an order ability on a 7-power unit, whether that be Varaxis, Gerhardt, Taller, Caretaker, One-Eyed Betsy, or any other unit with an order that you boosted up to 7 power, and you could summon Donamir, Northern Realms Defender, to the same row as Kimbolt, making it much more likely that you could at least get 1 more turn to summon another card from your deck. And obviously, if for whatever reason your opponent isn't able to answer him, then the possibilities for what you could do with Kimbolt are endless, because he can summon any and every unit from your deck, the only limitation being that it has to match power with whatever unit you're using the order ability on, giving you both consistency and just pure points. And although those 3 1-point deck boosts might not seem like a huge deal, it is a small way to try to match the power of your cards on the board with the power of the cards in your deck. So overall, there are some tremendously powerful new Northern Realms cards. 1 card that seems like a cheesy gimmick, and 1 card that for some reason gives additional support to one of the most hated cards in the game. There are definitely many ways to use the new cards, especially the legendaries, so there will probably be a lot of experimentation on the first few days, but I'm sure that eventually people will settle in on what they think the best way to use the new cards will be. Just be careful, because even after that, your opponent might catch you off guard by using those cards in a more unconventional way. So what do you think of the new Northern Realms cards? What do you think are the best ways to use Demavin and Kimbolt? Will you play them safe and simple, or will you play ambitiously instead? And because these are the last cards of the Tide Rises expansion, I suppose we could do some overarching reflections upon the set as a whole. And big picture, although there are a lot of new, incredibly powerful, exciting cards that I'm sure lots of people will want to play, if I think about how they're going to affect the state of Gwent beyond the first couple of weeks of hype, then to be honest, I'm kinda terrified. because many of these cards are ridiculously powerful, potentially overbearingly so, because for each faction, it feels like whatever archetype got the most support from the new cards is going to immediately become the best deck in that faction, and it's not even going to be close. The one exception maybe being Scoia'tael, because although they got a bunch of really powerful cards like everyone else, they also had a huge nerf to the Traps archetype, which they might have been able to manage against the old decks that the other factions would use, but with the huge power creep for every other faction, Scoia'tael might be the odd faction out. I know it was really strong last season, but it was the only faction that got nerfed in this patch. And if the new cards are really that much better than all the existing cards, then that might mean that there's functionally one deck per faction, giving us bad deck variety, which is not good for the overall health of the Gwent community. Of course, there will still be people who play old archetypes that were unaffected by all these new cards, but if they determine that doing that puts them at a big disadvantage against players who are using the new cards, then we'll have a positive feedback loop of an ever-increasing percentage of people playing the same deck. Because right now it feels like rather than nerfing overpowered cards to level the playing field, instead we're getting equally, if not increasingly, oppressive cards to fight fire with fire. And anything else will be left in the dust. Obviously, I am still really excited to try out all the new cards, test out some of the combos that we've been theorizing, and discover ones that we didn't even know existed, but I must say, this dynamic seems really unsustainable. Don't even get me started on how there are lots of new cards that are point slams, have control, and our engines all combined into one, and how that erodes the fundamental design principle of point slams being outpaced by engines, engines being shut down by control, and control being outscored by point slams. Or what the implications are for how you're supposed to stop these cards that no longer have any major weaknesses. Not to mention that it was one thing when you had to strategically choose when to use your limited damage and control cards so that you still had some left when your opponent played the most important cards for you to answer, but a totally different thing when you have near unlimited access to those abilities so that you always have an immediate answer to whatever your opponent does. Power creep takes many forms. So let me know what you think of the Tide Rises expansion on the whole as well. And who knows, maybe there's no reason to be worried at all. If you liked this video or any other of the Tide Rises expansion analysis videos that I did, which at this point have probably collectively taken me over 30 hours to make, then stick around for some Gwent deck guide videos, usually for the seasonal events, although I might start off this season in Standard. I also kind of made my own event, playing a bunch of different decks that only use one type of card, and we also just finished a blind Thronebreaker playthrough in which we did not craft a single card. So if any of that stuff sounds interesting, we have playlists for all of it. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you next time.